where it stood. This home is no longer standing today. This is where the now former Carter Bank is in Bassett, across from the Methodist Church. Stood this home right here. This was Craig and Bassett Funeral Home from 1944 to 1947. Here's advertisement for Mr. Mary Lindley being hired to replace Bill Collins as the funeral director. And then in 1947, we see McKee Funeral Home purchase Craig and Bassett and operate McKee Funeral Home in Bassett. And we know this because there's Craig and Bassett listed as a funeral director. And it says, we wish to announce effectively immediately that Craig and Bassett Funeral Home would now be operated as McKee. McKee stayed in Bassett for about 3 or 4 years and then realized that there wasn't enough money there because Collins kind of had the market in Bassett for a while. So Craig and Bassett is dissolved by 1947, but the total business in Bassett by 1950. Collins starts on his own in 1944. He purchases a house on Main Street, a little white house that's still standing today. It's been added on to by Bassett Funeral Service, but this was Collins Funeral Home from 1944 to 1962. So Collins moves here. He and his family live in the upstairs, operate the funeral home out of the downstairs. And here's an ad for their emergency hearse services for when disaster strikes, and so it is with funeral services. And this is actually one of the only pictures I've ever seen of this side of the building. Because if you think about old Bassett photos, most of them are taken towards the stone block or near the train station. Not too many are taken from that far down Main Street looking up. So this is one of the few photos I've seen. This was taken from the warehouse windows looking up Main Street in Bassett. And here's a bill from Collins Funeral Home of 1955. All-in cost was $780, but the VA paid $630 of it. Signed by Big Bill Collins. In 1962, Bill Collins moves his family from Main Street up to behind where the service station is in Bassett. Back then it was called Church Street, but now it's called Bullocks Drive. And he moves into the former Hollingsworth house, where he operates the new Collins Funeral Home out of that location from 62 to 78. And again, they have their fleet of hearse/ambulances. And that kind of goes away when local fire departments and local EMSs get their start in the 60s and 70s. But here it is. That house still stands today, right there, just off Main Street in Bassett. And briefly, Collins operated a funeral home in Collinsville, right there on Wheeler Avenue, about a quarter mile from the intersection where Najars and stuff is. It was just down there on the left. That building still stands, but it's been heavily modified. Collins moved in 1978 to their current location, which is right there across from the Bassett High School on Riverside Drive. This is a photo of it being constructed in 78. In 1986, Bill Collins Jr. Buys McKee Funeral Home, and in 86 we see the switch to Collins McKee. And then in 1992, Bill Collins Jr. sells to the Lineberry Funeral Group, which is out of Greensboro, and they take over operation of Collins McKee, which are still both operating, and they are now what's called the Dignity Group. And we'll talk more about them here in a second. McKee Funeral Home. Jim McKee got his start right there at Stoltz and Shoemake, just across the way. Jim McKee started out working as the trained undertaker for Stoltz and Shoemake. In the 1930s, he decided, I think it's 1933 or 35, he decides he wants to branch out on his own. And he opens up the first funeral home in Martinsville at 29 Broad Street. And this building still exists today. It's been heavily whitewashed, but you can drive by and see the original McKee Funeral Home at 29 Broad Street right there on the left. Here's a picture of it in its modern or past glory with the green roofs and green awnings and stuff. And then here's a picture of their ambulance schedule again. So they ran everything out of this building. And then, like I said, in 47, they purchase Craig and Bassett, move into Bassett briefly. By this point, Jim McKee has died, and his wife Ina is running the business. Ina continues to run the business until her death a couple of decades later. That's why it says Mrs. Ina McKee, who owns and operates McKee Funeral Home. In the 1970s, they moved down Broad Street to their current location. I think it was 1973, and they opened up McKee Funeral Home on Broad Street. Now, this is a very important date to note, because in 1973, when McKee opens this funeral home, this was the first funeral home in the area that was also not a residence. Because keep in mind, Bill Collins was still living in the 60s and 70s. This was the first time a funeral home operated that wasn't somebody's actual home. So this was 1973. And then later, after being purchased by Collins and morphed into the Lineberry Group, it would eventually become Collins, McKee, and Stone. And we'll talk more about Stone here in just a second. Briefly, in Martinsville, over on Starling, somewhere near where the Church of Christ is, there was the Smith Funeral Home, and then there was a Towns Funeral Home, and then they operated Smith Towns for a few years. This is about all I can find on Smith Towns. But this house would have stood somewhere near where the Church of Christ is, right there in that little bend. Then later, that became Spicegood Fox Funeral Home. Again, same. You can tell it's the same building, just different name. They probably sold the business. But the more important one that operated right in that area was Stone Funeral Home. Stone Funeral Home gets its start in the 1950s. I think in 1956, I believe. And they are operating right there in that same area. Think about where the fire department is. That's where the original Stone Funeral Home was. There's their fleet of hearse/ambulances in the 1950s. Stone Funeral Home operated up until the mid 2000s or 1990s, 2000s, when they were also purchased by the Lineberry Group, and the Lineberry Group closed them and kept the name in name only. But that's how you get Collins, McKee, and Stone. They were all purchased by the same entity, but the entity didn't see a need for having a funeral home on Broad Street and one in Starling, but they wanted to keep the Stone name because it had been in the community for over 50 years, or about 50 years at that point. So that's where we get Collins, McKee, Stone. Also, there was a Stone and Stone Mize Funeral Home that operated in Bassett. I've been told that the time frame of that is as Bill Collins is moving out of his home on Main Street in 62 and moving into his house on Church/Bullock's Drive, Stone moves into that home and kind of runs their business out of there. Now, I've seen this come up as Stone Funeral Home. I've seen it come up as Mize Funeral Home. I've seen Stone Mize. And then I've later seen Stone Bassett, Bassett Mize. Who knows what all the entities are. But it was the same conglomerate that operated there. And then later became Bassett Mize and then Bassett Tomlinson later on. And this is an advertisement from Bassett Funeral Home. I think this was in the 50s or 60s that they now had a new funeral director and embalmer named Frank Pounds. The Watkins Funeral Home, for the African American community, Watkins, the Reverend George Watkins, was one of the first people to start embalming in the area, period, white or black. And he started doing embalming out of his home in 1912. He opens Watkins Funeral Home in the 1930s. He hires a guy by the name of Reginald Hairston to come be his funeral director, and when Hairston takes over the business, he changes it to Hairston Funeral Home in 1949. But it got its origins with the Watkins Funeral Home. Right beside Harrison Funeral Home, there was another African American funeral home called the Allen Funeral Home. If this is a street image taken in 07 or 08. This is now a parking lot for Harrison. If you drive down Fayette Street today, this is now a parking lot. This is the former Allen Funeral Home that started in the 30s and operated until the 1970s. So we had two competing funeral homes side by side. And here is an ad for that. And the dates from all this come from a book that's in the gift shop downstairs about the history of Fayette Street. There's a whole page dedicated to black undertakers and black morticians in Martinsville. So you can see exactly when these two guys would have worked at Allen. Harrison Funeral Home gets started in 1949, but it's already growing out of the Watkins business. And then they operate at 301 Fayette Street, and they have since 1949. And they now own the lot that Allen Funeral Home used to sit on. Other African American funeral homes in this area There's a Martinsville Funeral Home, which operated at 313 Fayette Street, a little bit further down. The Pritchett Funeral Home was at 928 Church Street, and which later became Stanfield Miller. I'm pretty sure this is where, if you're driving down East Church Street, right there after you pass like Burger King and stuff, and going to that bend where Hardee's is, was that glass building, building with a lot of glass in it today. And obviously probably didn't look that way in the 70s, but I think that's the street address. Then Stanfield Miller took it over, and then Stanfield Miller moved to right down the street here at the corner of Fayette and Market, and they stayed there, open there for a few years until they closed, I think in 2016. And then Hines Funeral Home operates in Starling, again near the fire department, and they've been in operation since 2001. Roselawn started out as just being a cemetery. It got its start in the 1930s. It was named by a teenage girl who won a naming contest put on by the local, I think it was the local newspaper, the Bulletin. She named it Rose Lawn, and then a few years later she died in an auto accident and was one of the first burials in Rose Lawn. Rose Lawn had massive expansion plans. This is one of the early blueprints of what they wanted Rose Lawn to look like. So if you can kind of imagine, get oriented. Here's McCabe Baptist Church here. This is the entrance to Rose Lawn from Clearbrook, and this building is still there. This is the office and main area. And then you can see they wanted to go further back and expand all the way up until where those residences are now, off of like Grayson Street. This was originally planned to be 50-some acres, but they have since sold off those back parcels back there, and it's now cut down to 25 or 26 acres. But this was the original plans for Rose Lawn back in the day. And when Rose Lawn opens up its funeral home in the 1970s, they become the only operation in the entire state to have a funeral home connected to a cemetery. And they remained that way up until a couple years ago, when there was one in Fredericksburg or Stafford that opened a joint operation. But for 40, 50 some years, Rose Lawn was the only one in the state where you could have your funeral and be buried at the exact same location under the exact same business. Tomlinson Funeral Home operated over in Ridgeway, behind, I think it was the Crest Star Bank right there when you turn right before you get to the racetrack and go back behind the former bank location. Tomlinson operated his funeral home there, Charlie Tomlinson, and then he also was the co-owner of the one in Bassett for a number of years. Norris Funeral Home opens in 1996 in this area. They opened their Kings Grant location in 1996, but I've been told by some sources that their original plan was to open up on Main Street in Bassett, but they couldn't get the funding right to open or to do the renovations to where Bassett Funeral is now, so they open up in their location on Kings Grant, and of course now they've expanded to 7 different locations across Southside and Southwest Virginia. But their first location was here in Martinsville 30 years ago. Wright Funeral Home opened in 2011. Tony Wright worked for Collins for years and then eventually opened up his own business. And now he is the owner and operator of Fairhaven Memorial Park, which is on 58 heading west in the horse pasture community. So again, not necessarily the same business entity, and you can't have your funeral and then go a couple hundred yards and get buried. But Wright is now a one-stop shop for both funeral and burial. Bassett Funeral Services opens in 1996. Paul Kennedy and Darrell Martin opened their doors in January of 1996, and they're still open 30 years later. They operate out of the original Collins location, but they've since added on to it. But you can still see the remnants of the original Collins house if you're driving down Main Street. Right. I wanted to end here by putting out a little bit of trivia for you. This is an Orthodox Jewish casket. Does anybody know why it's Orthodox Jewish casket? What makes sense? What's so special about it?
They don't embalm.
They don't embalm. Jewish custom is you have no more than 48 hours after a person is deceased to get them into the ground. And Jewish culture very much dictates ash to ash, dust to dust. And this is a casket that has no metal whatsoever in it. Everything is put together using wood dowel rods, and this is a completely biodegradable casket. So when it's put in the ground, it will eventually be absorbed by the ground. And this was on display at the Museum, but I thought it was pretty neat. One last thing, and then I will open it up for questions and comments. I know I've kept you here long enough. I have gotten into the business of cleaning headstones, so if you're in the market of needing your headstone or a loved one's headstone clean, let me know. There's my website and email, and example of some stuff I've done over in Oakwood. So if you have any questions, I'll be glad to answer them or attempt to answer them. Yes, sir.
Who or what or who owns Dignity?
Dignity, that is the Lineberry Group sold them to a Canadian group then called Lowen, Loewen, and they've transformed the name of that business into the Dignity Group. But they're actually based out of Canada.
What?
They're based out of Canada. It's a Canadian corporation, and you'd be surprised how many things you think are local are actually owned by corporate entities. Roselawn and Henry Park up on 220 are owned by the same company that's based out of Florida. And then, of course, Collins McKee are owned by Lowen, but it's the growing corporation list in the funeral home industry. It's kind of surprising. Things that you think are local aren't necessarily local. Yes, sir.
What happened to all the stuff that was in the China Museum there?
That's a good question. When they closed their doors end of last year, they had a massive public auction. Now, not everything in there was theirs. They had a lot of stuff on loan from different museums and different private collectors. I was telling Graves earlier that they had the exact model casket that Elvis Presley was buried in, the exact model casket that Marilyn Monroe was buried in. Those were on loan from different funeral homes, actually. But they did a massive auction of everything that they owned. I have a couple of their pieces up here, but due to the auction company being located in Pennsylvania and a wife that didn't want random funeral stuff in her basement, I wasn't able to get more. But they auction off everything. But there's a pretty vast market for funeral collectibles out there. There's a few companies that I know that's all they do is they drive around the country and collect random funeral things. Like, for example, those vintage embalming bottles back there, if they were empty, they would go for about 50 to 60 a piece. That's if they're empty. So there's a very niche market, but it is a very profitable one. Hold on, yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Does Virginia allow green or natural burial?
It's up to the cemetery. They do, but it's up to each individual cemetery. I think that's going to be a growing trend that we do see as going right along with cremation. For those of you who don't know, green burial is no embalming, nothing. They just put your body back into the ground, and the ground absorbs it. Kind of, again, the ash to ash, dust to dust type thing. It's very much based on locality, but I don't think there's any legislation against it.
Is there anything done in this area?
Not that I know of. You can, and this may be more trouble than it's worth, you can section off a piece of your own property and do it, but you would have to designate a piece of your property as a cemetery. And then with that, a cemetery has to have a governing board, and you have to have meeting minutes every year. So you have to turn in that stuff to the locality to prove that you have a cemetery. But if it's your plot of land, you can do whatever you want to with it as long as you're a trustee.
You have at least a Jewish cemetery.
Oh yes, there is a Jewish cemetery in Ridgeway next to Mountain View Cemetery, the Ohev Zion Cemetery. It's a very well kept cemetery, but very different customs. And I've got some pictures of the headstones if you want to see them. You know how it's tradition in our culture to leave flowers on a grave, or maybe even leave pennies and stuff. Jewish culture, they leave rocks on the grave because they don't want to leave money on a grave. And rocks are eternal, whereas flowers will eventually fade and die, or be blown over and be stolen. So if you go to a Jewish cemetery like the one in Ridgeway, you'll see a lot of rocks on their headstones. And a lot of the headstones in the Ohev Zion Cemetery also use the traditional Jewish calendar dates. So you'll see the modern calendar dates, and then below it, they'll have the Jewish calendar dates as well. Yes, sir.
Is there a time when vaults were required by law?
I'm not sure. I still don't think they are, but it's up to each locale. I know, for example, my wife's grandfather was, he passed away a couple years ago, and he was buried in a church cemetery in Manita that did not require one. But I think it's up to each cemetery. A lot of your municipal ones do require it simply for the groundskeeping purposes. They don't want to be mowing over it and their mower sink in one day. I think it's up to each individual cemetery. I don't think there's any legislation on it. Any more questions? Well, feel free to come check out this stuff up here. I've got a couple of niche treasures from that museum, and thank y'all for coming out today.